I'm very happy today to be speaking with Alfie Bown, the author of the PlayStation Dreamworld. Thank you so much for being on today, Alfie. I'm wondering if maybe you can begin by saying a little bit about when you began to compare and think about the dream work and psychoanalysis in relation to video games and contemporary media.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I've always been a gamer. I've been video gaming all my life, really, since a very young child. And I wanted to write about video games. I sort of came across, I hadn't really heard of this kind of game studies community at all. And I kind of came across all this stuff. And I kind of had the feeling that a lot of the stuff that people were writing on video games is applying a toolkit from a different field to the study of games. So you've got a lot of people from maybe with a literary studies background like myself who would apply kind of narrative theory and stuff to video games. And then you've got people from film studies background who kind of use kind of film studies theory and toolkits to just discuss video games. And the same for kind of new media. And my kind of feeling is that video games are like very, very different to all those other kinds of media, you know, film, TV, other kinds of new media. And that like a whole different toolkit would be needed to discuss them. They don't kind of lend themselves to just to this kind of applying existing toolkits to video games. So that, alongside the sort of feeling I have that like, I mean, I do actually believe that the video games are probably the most significant cultural phenomenon of our moment. I think that like you can easily see that in the 60s and 70s, Hollywood cinema massively transformed the way people think, the way they desire, their empathies, sympathies, things like that. And I believe we're in the same kind of revolution video games today where, you know, whether you play video games or you don't, they are part of a kind of cultural transformation of the way we think, the way we desire, the way we empathize, the way we work, the way we play. They have the power or potential to be as transformative as Hollywood cinema. So I was looking for ways to think about how to discuss these changes which happen to the subject in the video game world. And that's why I kind of ended up with psychoanalysis, which is a kind of method for studying different kinds of desire, different kinds of affects, emotions, empathies, things like that.
Yeah, and I never really considered it playing a PlayStation game or playing a video game in general as like a dream world, but then you explain it using, of course, Freud, Lacan, but also Walter Benjamin. And I'm curious if you had one in mind in terms of either maybe those three or someone else and their description of dreams that really made you have that connection.
So like I was saying before, you know, I was thinking that video games are not films, video games are not TV shows, and they're not other things. And so I came to this idea that maybe video games are more like dreams than they are like films, for example. That comes from two, I think, equally influential perspectives. As we said, my book is mainly about psychoanalysis because that's really my history of research. But in this particular concept of the PlayStation Dreamworld or the video game Dreamworld, it's really influenced by equally by psychoanalysis and by, yes, as you say, the work of the German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin. For Freud and later for Lacan, you know, the dream is something that you experience maybe when you're asleep or recounted later. But for Benjamin, the dream world or dreaming is something that takes place when you're awake. And Benjamin uses the example of the Parisian arcades from 19th century France. You know, these kind of huge glass structures full of commodities where when you enter them, you feel as though you're in a semi-conscious state, a kind of dream state, while you wander around this kind of exciting world of commodities that produces pleasures and feelings and things like that. So for Benjamin, the dream world is very much part of the city and something you explore when you're awake. I think it's interesting that we call places to go and video game arcade, and I think that's not necessarily a coincidence that there's something about video gaming which relates to these kind of arcades. That's for the 19th century arcades.
Yeah, that's a pretty amazing connection that you make. Yeah.
That's like a fun one. So my feeling is that the new dream world, you know, is the one which we enter through our screens, you know, through our consoles, through our PCs, through our smartphones. Not the one which we enter through a door in the streets into these kind of, you know, arcade spaces, but we enter a kind of dream world through our screens on a daily basis, most of us, if not all of us. So when I'm talking about the dream world, I'm talking partly about psychoanalytic conceptions of dreams, but equally about this idea from Benjamin that the dream state is part of modern life. And today's dream state is the technological one, which we enter through our screens and which I feel is kind of embodied by video games. So I think both of those two models are kind of equally influential for this kind of conception of the dream world.
Yeah, well, and the way that you describe it as something that you enter on a regular basis, and that in some sense it feels almost like lucid dreaming, and in other cases it's like you're removed from this dream and it's coming from somewhere else. I think it's, if not explicitly thought about in that way, implicitly, I think to most people, especially gamers, that just resonates, or at least it did for me.
No, I think that's right. I think it's intuitively the case, isn't it? That, when you're playing a video game, you're not unconscious or asleep, but nor are you fully awake in the way that you would be if you're not playing a video game. So I was interested in this kind of, let's call it a kind of interim state or semi-conscious state, which seems to be produced by these products, these video games. And then I think that it extends out to other aspects of our kind of social and technological life. So this kind of semi-aware state may be visible outside video games as well, as a kind of part of our relationship to technology and things like that. But I definitely think video games is the most perfect embodiment of a technology which aims to put the user into this kind of in-between space where you are thinking and you're aware of your thoughts, but you're also, in a certain extent, acting impulsively and instinctually and unconsciously.
To me, and I think probably anyone else who comes across this idea of yours that you write about, it's a question, or one question that comes to mind, is whether or not there's agency on behalf of the dreamer in this case, or the gamer, or whether or not it's a cultural, ideological aspect that you touch on in the book. But generally speaking, I mean, I think we think of ourselves as dreaming a personal dream, even if it's from more of the unconscious. But of course, video games are made for us. And so how do you sort of negotiate agency when you think about video games as dream?
This is a brilliant question, and it gets to the heart why I think this connection can be useful. It's this, that dreams can teach us something about video games, but video games also teach us something about dreams. On the one hand, the important point is that when you have a dream, you have this feeling that this dream is somehow your own, kind of belonging to you. It's no one else's dream. It's your dream. And now video games are not like that at all. Of course, they are products of cultural forces. They are created by particular individuals and particular corporations, and you can see that they are political in the most obvious sense. I've been working recently on how in the Bush years there were quite a lot of games which kind of endorsed American foreign policy. Whereas in the Brexit years in the UK, you're actually seeing games which return to ideas of British Empire and things like that. And I mean, it's an obvious point, because also games are just like movies or TV, in that they reflect the political values of their moment, and also the values of the person and people and corporations who make them. So that could be said about almost any media. But what's different about video games compared to, say, film or TV is that when the gamer is actually playing, it doesn't feel like that. It's experienced on an instinctual and personal level. When you act in the service of American foreign policy while you're playing a video game, you do so instinctively, as if it's your own desire to do it, even if you're a lefty who totally disagrees with the values that the game is consciously endorsing. Video games have a strange difference between themselves and other forms of medium, where the gamers are able to have a kind of political and ideological agenda, but maybe kind of make it seem instinctual or naturalize that agenda by allowing the gamer to experience that ideology on a kind of personal level. So whereas when you watch a movie, you think that you're dealing with the opinions of the director or the writer or the characters, when you play a game, because you've got the controller in your hand and you're in this kind of dream state and you're impulsively going left and right and impulsively taking actions, those values which the game embodies or endorses somehow become instinctual to you. And I think this points to the danger of video games, the kind of, as well as, its massive potential. But if video games have the potential basically to transform something political and cultural into something instinctual and impulsive, and that's again why I use psychoanalysis. I mean, simple distinction is made by Jacques Lacan, where he says that distinguish between instincts and drives. Where instincts are maybe usually thought of as like internal impulses, whereas drives are, he says, drives give you a kick in the arse, my friend. A drive comes from outside as if kicking you in the arse and moving you forward. So, an instinct is like your own impulse, whereas a drive is when political and social conditions propel you in a certain direction. So how to think of video games in those terms? video games are drives which are kind of masquerading as instincts. So they are, when you play a game, political and cultural forces are propelling you in various directions, but you are tricked into feeling that you're instinctively going in those directions. So I think that video games have this incredible power to naturalize ideologies, or to make ideologies seem kind of instinctual or personal. And that also answers, I think, the question about dreams, because this is exactly how dreams work too. The truth is that dreams are not your own. That your dreams are also political, and they are controlled by political and cultural forces, but the dreamer experiences them as if they are your own dreams. So that's another kind of connection between them. And so, yeah, I think we need to kind of recognize this potential power that video games have to basically assert a ideological agenda and bring the user or the gamer into it as if it's their own agenda, as if it's their own kind of instinct to agree with it.
That makes a lot of sense. But I'm also worried or concerned, I guess, when I hear, for example, politicians in recent weeks saying that video games, violent video games, have caused mass shootings or have caused teens to act inappropriately and violence to come out, because I think a lot of people who study media, are much more aware of the nuances, as I know you are as well. But whenever I hear anyone attributing an action that somebody has done to a video game, I tense up a little bit as a media studies scholar. How do you negotiate that idea of gaining desires or drives from video games, but also, well, I don't know, how do you feel about these recent remarks?
Yeah, no, I mean, actually, it's very topical, isn't it? I mean, I've actually just been writing about it this week, and hopefully the piece will be out soon about exactly this issue because of the Trump claims. I think what Trump is doing is trying to make the school shootings about culture wars, to try and say that video games are the problem. It's a cultural problem. We need to address this cultural phenomenon in order to avoid actually tackling either gun law or the socio-economic problems which underlie events of mass shootings. So he's trying to kind of use this as a kind of distraction. And as you say, most people know that the idea is like almost considered defunct in media studies and things like that. But I do address the broader thing, the broader sense of it in the book, and think about these kind of two opposing positions, actually, because you had this old kind of what I would call like a baby boomer idea that video games caused violence, right? That young people would follow the rule, what GTA did or whatever. If you do some violent stuff in GTA, you'll probably do it in real life. That was the kind of thing that the baby boomers were worried about their kids doing. And then in response to that, in the 90s, you had a sort of alternative or opposite argument being made by some theorists, which is that video games provide a kind of outlet for frustrations which would otherwise be unleashed into social life. So, I mean, in a certain way, this is a sort of superficially psychoanalytic position, because it says that, you've got these pent-up frustrations and drives, and if you unleash them into the video game, that's better than unleashing them into the school, as it were. So you've got these kind of two opposed positions on video games, things like either GTA and Hotline Miami and things like that. They either cause violence or they sort of prevent it by providing an outlet. Now, I tried to sort of say that there's a problem with both of these views, is that they don't recognize that they all think that the desire pre-exists the games. So the first idea that video games cause violence is like saying, well, these young people have these violent drives, and if they're able to see them in action, they might replicate them. And the second position is even more guilty of that. It's the idea that we have these natural impulses to be kind of violent or misogynistic, and so better we should channel them into games than into real life. But both miss the point that video games are much more powerful than that, and they can actually transform desires and instincts and feelings, which is really the whole premise of my book, is to explore how video games, like Hollywood cinema before it, actually make us desire in new ways and actually transform desire. They don't just respond to already existing desires. So of these two positions, I actually prefer the first one, which is now considered kind of defunct, that video games might cause violence. I mean, I think it's totally wrong, and they meant it in the wrong way, the people who articulated it in that way. It's much more complicated than simply people will replicate what they play. But at least it recognizes that such cultural things as video games might actually have the potential to actually transform what it means to desire and the structures of desire and the way in which the gamer is affected. And I think they didn't actually mean that, but accidentally that is the better of the two positions, because I think that video games totally can enact, I think, what Jean-Francois Lyotard called a desire revolution, a revolution in desire. That like these products are not innocent at all, they're political, and they endorse certain values and encourage certain desires. And I think we should be kind of critically aware of that, even if it's of course wrong that video games are directly responsible for things like the mass shootings.
Yeah, well, actually, that makes me think of something that I noticed, I think because I'm working myself on something related to Google algorithms, so this caught my attention. You say, early in the book, Google's algorithms have long since dictated which restaurants people visit and which cafes they are aware of and so on. And that makes a lot of sense in this day and age because, yes, of course, people will look at their restaurant reviews or Yelp reviews or what have you, and that's often how people will make decisions. But at the same time, I think on the opposite end of that argument, Google could easily say that it has never recommended a restaurant, for example, that it simply collects what people have already recommended. And so there's this issue of, I guess, where does it start? So if video games, for example, are providing ideas or driving us towards certain things that maybe get sparked in us after playing or being exposed to these things, I think a lot of video gamers, like the producers of GTA, like Rockstar Games and others, have said they're doing something because the public want this. So how do you weigh those two? I guess it's almost like chicken and egg, but how do you start to make sense of this?
Well, look, I think it is like chicken and egg, and I think it's a really interesting way of talking about it is in relation to mobile phones. I mean, I'm also working now on another project which is more to do with apps than video games. It'll be about love and technology and how technology transforms desire and love. So this is what we're talking about now. And my first bit was about mobile phones, as you mentioned. I think this is the way to think about it. That these applications like WeChat. I mean, I'm actually in China, so applications like WeChat, and I'm from London, and I've been trying to do these kind of comparisons between New York, London, and some Chinese cities, and look at the ways in which these applications respond to the user's desire. But that's only half of what they do. And then, I mean, Pokemon Go is a good example of it that I discussed like a whole chapter on. Mm-hmm. Thought it was a fascinating phenomenon because the premise of Pokemon Go, which is basically a Google-controlled subsidiary company called Niantic, it was also like responding to the user's desire in a certain way. Like everyone already wants these kind of cute Pikachus and Clefairies, but it was also a kind of testing phase where Google would work out to what extent they could manipulate people's patterns through the city. So, it was well known in Hong Kong that one particularly expensive shopping mall was the only place you could catch a Porygon Pokemon in Hong Kong. And also that McDonald's were popular Pokestops because, there was some kind of connection between the companies, which meant that they could, basically they could sell the Pokemon to a shopping mall in order to increase revenue of the shopping mall. And the same for these kind of placing of Pokestops near McDonald's. So it's not just about giving the user what they want, but about gradually editing the desire of the user so that it matches these kind of corporate patterns, which can generate profit. And another great example is I was taken to I once gave a paper in Hangzhou in China, just like recently, and I was basically like saying how evil WeChat was. Mm-hmm. But then afterwards, I was taken on this kind of tour of Alibaba Cloud Town, which is, where Alibaba is based. And they showed me these amazing things. Like, I mean, it was all evil, but, but also fun. And the thing that fascinated me most was this car co-created by the car company Rover and Alibaba. And the premise of the car is that it's basically a sort of smart car. You've got a drone following you around all the time, taking photos and doing things for you. But one of the key features is that the phone, like, basically knows when you're hungry and, takes you to like restaurants that you might like on the basis of like your patterns and other people's patterns. So it syncs up with your smartphone, basically works out when you're likely to be hungry, and then offers you kind of advice about where you might like to eat. But of course, these things could be slightly biased towards like, it could just like, if you like sushi on a Tuesday at 5:00, you might not even realize that yourself, but the car realizes, which is already like kind of dystopian mad world. But then the car might recommend you go to a slightly different sushi restaurant because they accept Alipay instead of WeChat Pay. Now there, I think you're into a really, I mean, it sounds like kind of dystopia, but it also shows the kind of doubleness of these things, that these apps do not just work out your desire and give you what you want. That's only the first step. The first step is to work out what you want and how to give it to you. And the second step is to gradually edit those desires so that you can be turned to kind of profit for those corporations, or even, in the case of WeChat, especially in the service of the states. I mean, you can see there's these kind of massive links between the Beijing government and WeChat. So I think this is very dangerous that we have this conception that, well, it's just for convenience. It's just giving you what you want, because there's definitely a whole other side to it, which is kind of, which is just as powerful, which is more powerful and more worrying. And I think video games, whether the game makers realize it or not in every case, are doing the same thing. They're responding to users' desires. Okay, the makers of GTA can easily say, well, this is what the people want. But that doesn't mean that the other aspect isn't also happening. And that yes, you're responding to people's desires, but you're also editing them and changing them. And this is the kind of symbiotic relationship between desire and technology that we need if we're to understand how we're being transformed as subjects and as citizens of the city by new technologies. So yeah, as you say, it's a chicken and egg situation, and it's kind of a complicated one. And I think we need to recognize that, because if we don't see that that's the way these things are transforming us, we're not going to have any sort of control over the future cyborgs that we become, as it were.
Like you say, I think one of the main issues is that these things seem to often in the mainstream discourses boil down to it either does or does not create violence, or it does or does not create desire, or something like that. But it is, like you said, much more complicated than that, which
right.
One thing I found really interesting in the book is the way that you kind of destroy this dichotomy between subversive and non-subversive or conformist games in terms of what the content is, because as you demonstrate, seemingly subversive games like GTA can be very conformist in many ways. But I'm curious, because I'm still not 100% sure after reading it, whether you think that there is a significant possibility for subversive games.
Yes, I do. I think there's a possibility for it, and I think there's a massive, massive need, and a really vital need for them. I think that one of the things I've really tried to argue and show in the book is that games serve two groups. They serve the corporate, or what we can think of as a new kind of platform capitalism, a kind of techno-capitalism that we're seeing emerge now, where the corporate and the state are very linked. And I think we can see video games from mobile phones, AR games, VR games, all the way through to console computer games. We can see them serving this kind of official corporation and state agenda. And the other group that I think we can see video games serving is the far right. I think, of course, this has been written on in the context of Gamergate, and to an extent in Angela Nagel's book, Kill All Normies, which is getting a lot of kind of traction at the moment, which charts how Gamergate and online gamer threads kind of coalesced into the alt-right. And I think, of course, you can see that a lot of games have right-wing ideologies, not just centrist ones. Maybe I'd say that there are more Republican games than Democrat ones, for example. So I can see that games are serving these two types of value, one being kind of platform capitalist corporation, and another being maybe right-wing ideology. And I think there's a gap. I'm happy to say that more are emerging. There is this new game called post-capitalism, which is this is all stuff I've sort of come across since the book, and another game called Nova Alia, which are both about kind of socialist building games. And there are other examples which I discuss in the book, like Papers, Please. So, and I think that with indie gaming on the rise, basically means that the technology is there for almost any sort of tech savvy person to make a game. So there's definitely the technology is there for the left to start using gaming as a way to explore its values and express itself, and so I think this is like a gap which luckily we're just starting to see a rise of kind of what I would call left-wing games, but for the history of gaming that's been very absent. And I think if I'm right in any way that games are as powerful as Hollywood cinema was, it would be an absolute disaster if the left was not represented in them.
I guess, how do you know when you're dealing with a subversive game as opposed to basically a conformist game that seems to be subversive? How do you recognize certain signs, or what would you recommend looking for if somebody is interested in figuring that out?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I suppose the sort of two things I've kind of called for in the kind of conclusion of the book, because most of it's like a study of the existing situation, but the conclusion is about what we can do going forwards. And the two things I've kind of asked for is one, more left-wing games on the market, and I think we can see the other reason for that is that it always seems like the right is so quick and willing to mobilize and use technology to its advantage. I've also given various examples of that from the video game world and also from other examples. One of my favorite ones is Microsoft's Twitter bot Tay from 2016. Who, the Twitter bot was just designed to sort of talk to people on Twitter as if it was a human. But within, you spent 5 minutes being like a nice, normal person. And then all these right-wing people on Reddit and 4chan had kind of gathered and worked out how to use the Microsoft bot to spread right-wing propaganda and pro-Trump propaganda. So it's a good example of how, while the left was like not doing anything, the right saw a kind of opportunistic opportunity to, use that technology to its advantage. Another example of that was when the Clinton emails leaked. And again, all the right-wing people in the pro-Trump camp across the world actually were kind of mobilizing instantly to work out how to use this technology to push right-wing values, help get Trump elected. And you can see that pattern in video games too, I think, that, you've got a lot of technology which is now open access and publicly available, and people are using that to make more right-wing games. So I think we need to kind of counter that trend and do the opposite, become quite tech-savvy on the left and start to use all these new forms of technology which are available quicker, more efficiently, to kind of get our own voices heard in these kind of massive conversations. And the second thing, so the first thing I asked for is that, so more left-wing engagement on these platforms. And the second is to sort of try to play these games against the grain. I suppose this relates more directly to what you just asked me, is that you can play Call of Duty in a kind of subversive way, potentially, even if it might be the least subversive game on the market. You just need to sort of recognize these patterns that the games are asserting a particular kind of ideology. And if the game, as I kind of argued earlier to you, if the game gives you the opportunity to experience ideology on a personal level or enjoyment on a personal level, you can experience that enjoyment and then reflect critically on it. So, if you're playing Call of Duty, you can easily kind of see that you could potentially undermine some of the connections between pleasure and foreign policy by playing it and reflecting on how powerful that ideology is and that it can produce a certain kind of pleasure. So I think we need two things. We need more left-wing games, and we need to play existing games against the grain of how they demand to be enjoyed. So I'm reluctant to answer the question of how to identify a good game or a bad game, because I don't think you can do that. I don't think that's how it is. I mean, even the worst game ideologically could be played against the grain of how it wants to be enjoyed, and you could confront some interesting questions about enjoyment that way. So I basically think we just need to be much more critical, not only of the content of games, I think this is another key point, but of the enjoyment they produce. And I think that's another thing to say. My book is not a study of the content of all these games, right? Although, of course, I do have to talk about that from time to time. It's more a study of the kinds of enjoyment that gaming produces and how these different kinds of enjoyment affect us. And I think we need, this is the kind of critical approach that we need. When we play a game and we experience enjoyment, we need to kind of reflect on that enjoyment and how it is politically constructed and what it means. And that would be enough, I think.
I think that's a great point that you raise in the book, is that merely talking about the characters, for example, or the development of the plot or the themes that are present in the game itself is fine. I mean, it works to do certain things, but it doesn't really explain how, especially video games are a special medium in a sense that they do something that is different than what earlier literary studies attempted to understand.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, and you write, for example, even once you start using psychoanalysis, you say psychoanalysis is needed more than ever, but that it is needed in a different way. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you can take psychoanalysis to start thinking about these questions of desire that go beyond, I guess, a non-critical literary studies approach, But then what do you do with them after that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, yes, I criticized earlier the idea of just applying certain kinds of toolkits to video games and how that doesn't work, right? So, film studies toolkits, new media toolkits can't be applied. And I think the same is true of psychoanalysis. I'm not just doing the same thing and applying an existing psychoanalytic toolkit to video games, because, I mean, this confronts a big problem in psychoanalysis studies as well, that, I mean, many people think that psychoanalysis refers to a particular kind of subjects, which according to, say, many Deleuzians, has already kind of broken down in some ways. So psychoanalysis would not apply to today's global subjects in the way it might have applied in the 60s to the Western male subject, for example. Now, I think those points are really valid, and they also would apply if I'm right that we're becoming cyborgs, or we've always been cyborgs and we're becoming a different kind of cyborg in the kind of Donna Haraway sense, then psychoanalysis might not apply in the same way to these new subjectivities which are being created, right? Because the subject for psychoanalysis was a different subject to the ones which are being produced by today's technological, political, cultural things. So one of the questions I wanted to ask is psychoanalysis going to be relevant or any longer relevant in this kind of, with these new subjects which are being produced by technology? And my conclusion or my feeling is that, psychoanalysis could be more relevant than ever, as you said, but that it also needs to kind of change. And psychoanalysis will need to develop as well in order to deal with the new kinds of subjects. You can't simply apply the logic of a former subject to these new subjects which are appearing. So I think that, you can see it in a simple way, because what is happening, desires are changing, affects are changing, empathies are changing, and these are all the topics of psychoanalysis, right? To understand affects, to understand emotions, to understand desire, to understand enjoyment, especially in the case of Lacan. And so if those things are changing, then psychoanalysis could be very relevant in helping us conceptualize those changes. But also, we will need psychoanalysis to change in order to deal with these new subjects. So I wanted to kind of place video games and psychoanalysis in conversation, and see if they could kind of move each other on in a certain way, rather than just sort of proving psychoanalysis right.
So if you were to update, or I guess add to the general understanding of psychoanalysis while thinking about video games, what is the first thing that changes in your mind?
It's hard to answer in a broad way. I could just give one example, though. I mean, which goes back to the question of dreams. So, one common tendency, and one of the most famous topics of psychoanalysis is dreams, and the principal arguments given about dreams is that dreams are disguised infantile wishes, or the fulfillment of disguised infantile wishes. So dreams are kind of displaced way of fulfilling repressed thoughts and feelings. Now, I wanted to sort of change that round, and just by adding kind of one word, actually, and say that the problem we have now is that dreams are disguised as the repressed impulses of our own. So, whereas Freud thought that dreams were in fact revealing our impulses, because of the kind of saturation of Freud perhaps into culture in the 60s, and because of all those Hitchcock and Woody Allen films and how transformative they were, like we now have a conception that dreams represent internal and instinctive desires of ours, and now we have like something like video games which preys upon that cultural assumption. And actually, deliberately works by, in my opinion, by playing off that. And because we will see our dreams as instinctual, it allows ideological things to appear as instinctual things, as I kind of argued with you before. So the difference, I mean, Freud would say dreams are disguised fulfillment of infantile wishes, and I have said that dreams are disguised as the fulfillment of our infantile wishes. Now, so I'm saying that there's a shift has happened. Now, what's important about dreams is that because of cultural conditions and discourses around them, we believe them to be instinctual. So in a way, it's actually saying the opposite of what Freud says, that dreams, we now need to sort of go to the next step and see that psychoanalysis, this is another defense of studying psychoanalysis, in my opinion. It really is. I mean, a lot of people would take this line that psychoanalysis is outdated, but it has such a huge cultural effect through the 60s and 70s, and continues to have a cultural effect that it can't be ignored. I'm actually arguing that ideas of psychoanalysis transformed what dreams are, and now we need to reflect on that. So I guess that's just one example of how we need to update a particular concept. So, the idea of dreams in psychoanalysis needs updating. It can only be useful if it is brought into the kind of contemporary understanding of dreams. And I think, you'd need to do that across the board. I can't say the one way in which psychoanalysis could be transformed, but with each of its concepts, you'd need to think about how those kind of concepts would apply differently or would function differently in today's context, especially in the technology context.
One thing that was interesting that you just said to me about not being able to tell whether a game per se is good or bad because you have to think about how a player is using it. And there are multiple ways of approaching the study of games, let's say. If you were to decide that you wanted to approach a certain game being played or maybe a big game that's been released or something, I'm wondering if you could take me through a little bit of your method, whether or not that's a very clear method that you have in your mind or maybe just a sort of loose way of approaching it, because it seems to me that there's the text, viewing the game as text, right, which you've said already is not adequate for a game because video games are inherently different than the traditional literary text or something. But but there is the content. Then there's the interface, and then there's maybe the background or the political economy of it. And then, of course, there's the way that the user uses or makes uses of the game. And there's probably so many other things that you could start with. How do you start by analyzing a game? If there's a new big game that you decide that you're going to study or incorporate into the next book, how do you look at a video game?
Yeah, good. I suppose I'm interested to sort of compare the form and the content. So the first thing I'll do is think about, like, as you say, the obvious content. I mean, let me maybe talk through it with the example of Splatoon 2, which I've been playing on the Nintendo Switch recently, I've been playing that since the book, so it's not part of it. But, so the content of Splatoon 2 is, well, same as Splatoon. It's just paint guns, spraying, little caricature cartoons, spraying each other with paint. It's a little bit skate punky, but apart from that, it's basically innocent kind of paint spraying, and the content, the actual visible content is completely innocent. It's almost like Nickelodeon. It is playing on the appeal of that Nickelodeon paint splat and allowing you to kind of experience that. It's like very it does kind of in a psychoanalytic way go back to childhood impulses in that way. But the form, then you pay attention to the form and you see that we're looking at these kind of wider patterns of video gaming, like territory acquisition, capture the flag, defense of borders. So there's odd similarities on the formal level between Call of Duty and Splatoon. So whilst, the Arabs and bullets have been replaced by cartoons and paint guns, the structure of playing it and the enjoyment it produces might be more comparable than it seems to some of those like really obvious where the content is kind of ideological warfare. So that's one thing I think. I'm always much more suspicious of games which don't seem ideological than ones which do. So that's one thing I would tend to think about. And then just to ask then, what is the game actually asking me to feel? What is my enjoyment of this game supposed to support? And I think, it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say that the enjoyment of Splatoon is about defending your borders and, territory acquisition, and things like that. And a good example would be something seemingly innocent like Stardew Valley. This is one which arose out of the Trump years as well. It's a farming simulator, a little bit like Farmville, but much more complicated. These things seem to be totally innocent and they actually present themselves as apolitical. But here is where the politics really is. And that, the Stardew Valley and other farm simulators, they endorse this kind of nostalgic return to pastoral values, natural serenity, critique of modernity, kind of backwards looking idolization of the pastoral past, which actually is not so far from the kind of Trump rhetoric at times. Mm-hmm. So I think what I tend to do is look at the context in which the game has emerged. Of course, the enjoyment of Stardew Valley is different to the enjoyment of Harvest Moon, which is a Nintendo game from decades ago with a similar kind of principle, because it arises in a different context. So I think what we need to do is first of all look at the context in which the game arises, like the political context, the social discourses surrounding those things, and then think about in what way is the game relating to those kinds of discourses that are surrounding in our society. So in the Brexit years, in the years leading up to Trump, a nostalgic farming simulator which idolizes the pastoral past is probably not serving a progressive left-wing agenda, even if it seems like the most innocent game going. So I guess my method would be more like that, actually to just pit the game off against its context and its political context. And that's something I think slightly different to many game studies books. I suppose what I think was unique about my book, because there are lots of books on games. There's lots of books on like games and theory, critical theory, which is my book is also. But there really isn't books on like games and politics with a capital P. And this what I'm trying to do is to compare games to the political context and ask, what kinds of ideologies are they incubating? Maybe on an unconscious level, these games are actually influencing elections, without us actually having any awareness of that. So my method is to compare the game to its political context and try to identify which of the kind of political discourses it's serving, or if better, which it's calling into question.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I'm thinking about the books that I've read recently, like in the last few years, about video games, and yeah, they all do seem to be sort of, if not apolitical, then somewhat ahistorical, as if the game could exist at any time. But of course, it changes depending on the context in which it's released. Yes, exactly. I mean, and there is a really good book. I think it's called Playing War. It's definitely a New York University Press book about how in the aftermath of 9/11, it just was a huge boom for the video game industry, and all these games were completely ideological, and basically the games were a response to 9/11 in various ways, and helped American discourse to kind of deal with 9/11, but also in very negative ways to kind of there's the anti-Islamic trends and things like that. But yeah, I'm not just saying that games are a product of their moments. I think that our political moment can also be a product of games. That's what I'm trying to get at. That it could be the case that these games are arising because of political discourses, but it's also could be the case that if there's dominant trends in video gaming, for example, which now has just such a huge penetration rate in the Western world and actually globally. I mean, the penetration rate of games in Africa is like really surprising. I can't remember the exact statistic, but I did include some things like that. Like it's really got this huge global penetration rate. So if these games are selling particular ideological values, they're not only responding to political ideologies, but they're actually potentially preparing people on an unconscious level to later agree with or endorse political values. So I do think of games as also kind of incubating political trends before those political trends actually arise in discourse. And I think that's why I was kind of in one section of the book, I was trying to make this argument that games predict the future, which is kind of similar, sort of playfully made rather than deadly serious. But this is the way in which they do predict the future, that because the games relate in some way to our unconscious desires, they can actually reveal to us in advance what kinds of desires, what kinds of politics, what kinds of empathies are likely to emerge in the future, because they can sometimes appear in games before they actually erupt into the mainstream political discourse. Yeah, well, especially on a sort of unconscious level, that people may be drawn to things that they don't realize, and that's a really interesting way to think about it. Exactly, yeah, that's it. That all said, it sounds like you still enjoy playing games. Is that right? Yeah. So I'm curious to hear about your desire and how you get pleasure from games, especially considering all that you've just said. Yeah. Okay. I guess I do want to say this. Actually, I'm glad you asked. I don't want to seem like some kind of Adorno who doesn't like games, and thinks that they're all evil. Even though I think that, as I've sort of said, I think that the trend is not going in the right way, and that I'm not saying that we shouldn't play games. I'm saying that we should rescue gaming and make it and open the possibilities for progressive games and for experience of games progressively, rather than I definitely don't think we shouldn't play them. But I do think your question is important in another way too. I much prefer Roland Barthes to Adorno in the way they talk about popular culture, and the reason is the really what do you call it, anecdotal one. Adorno tends to talk about things he doesn't like, and Roland Barthes always talks about things he really likes.
likes, especially the things that he feels he maybe shouldn't like. Like, I love Roland Barthes on wrestling and things like that, where it's like some kind of enjoyment is derived by him from wrestling, which doesn't really seem consistent with his other kind of enjoyments. And then he can use that to unpack and analyze the structure of enjoyment. And I believe that without actually enjoying it properly, you won't be able to comment on or reflect on the actual structure of those enjoyments. So we do actually need to play the games to actually enjoy the games on the level they demand to be enjoyed, in order to kind of reflect on the political effects and interesting pop cultural commentaries that you can make based on those enjoyments. So in a certain way, I modeled it on Roland Barthes' mythologies, where he takes various forms of pleasure and which he himself kind of often experiences, and then reflects on the political structures of those pleasures. So I still play them, and I massively play them. In fact, some people have sort of said to me, well, there's certain absences in the book, and that's absolutely true. I mean, I don't really talk about MMO games much, and the simple reason is because I don't particularly enjoy them, and I feel like therefore I'm not quite qualified to talk about them. I think in order to be qualified to talk about a game, you don't need to know a lot about it, but you need to have experienced its enjoyment in order to reflect on it.
That's really funny. I'm just picturing what it would be like if everybody who taught a subject had to enjoy that subject. I think education would change a little bit.
It would be. My instinct is to say that would be good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's definitely, well, and I've talked to others about this, both on the podcast with, like Nicholas Greco, for example, who studies popular music, but also outside of the podcast, there's a lot of consideration about the sort of how much enjoyment ought to be taken and how much of a critical stance ought to be taken when we're dealing with popular culture, especially popular culture that we're critiquing for potentially ideological reasons or political reasons, and yet basically a lot of us working in cultural studies are participating in this. And so at what point should we, if any, distance ourselves so that we are not subsumed by whatever the main or dominant message is? Do you reflect on the games afterwards? And so in other words, do you play them and then sort of analyze them, or do you find yourself analyzing them as you're playing them?
I think it's the first one. Even if it happens simultaneously, I definitely try to take the game on the terms it seems to want to be taken. So if Stardew Valley wants me to take pleasure in the recreation of natural harmony and nostalgic pastoral past, I try to experience those enjoyments fully without the kind of critical distance, because I think then you can see how powerful those things are in actually potentially incubating those ideologies. So I suppose I think it's maybe better to play first and think later, although it's not always possible to do that. That said, I can see the point you're making as well, and I agree. I mean, there is a certain way in which you can't just keep making the excuse that, wow, I'm spending hours and hours on Call of Duty, but I know it's rubbish, really. Yeah, I mean. That's like what's called disavowal in psychoanalysis, where it's awful ideologically, but you enjoy it nonetheless. And I think maybe there does have to come a point sometimes where you have to say, well, that's enough of that. And I think we need to do that if we're going to make the claim that I'm making here, that we need left-wing games. We're also going to need people to play them. And so, yes, if you're maybe someone more progressive, it would probably be better to give your support to these new and emerging games which are trying to counter those dominant trends than to just put all your hours into World of Warcraft or whatever. So, I guess we have to get the right balance. We definitely want to understand these dominant games, which, as you say, might be just the kind of mainstream narrative games and things like that. But there also has to be a point where we maybe draw a line and say that we're going to focus our attention on what could be thought of as the more progressive stuff.
Obviously, it's an emerging field of game studies, and it's going in a number of different directions depending on who you're reading and what kind of work is being conducted. Sometimes in terms of research facilities, but also in terms of critical theory and cultural studies. Where do you hope video games or video game studies goes? Where are some of the directions that you're hoping? I mean, you've already mentioned that we need to take psychoanalysis further than it has been prior to these kinds of dominant cultural events or phenomena. But where else do you hope that it goes? Either probably in your own work, I would assume, but also in others.
Okay, yeah, I've got three answers really. First is, as you say, I think psychoanalysis is needed, and the reason for that is, again, as I said before, is the question of enjoyment. And then Jacques Lacan is my main psychoanalytic interest. And his whole career really emerged from a feeling that existing models of philosophy had failed to account for enjoyment. He felt that that was the one thing that critical theory and philosophy had until then kind of failed to sufficiently account for. Now, I believe that's still true, and very true in video game studies, that we've got plenty of discussion of content, form, even the back systems, but not enough discussion of, we haven't sufficiently accounted for the forms of pleasure and enjoyment and desire produced by video games. And that is what, I mean, my book, as you know, is dead small, just like a very short, these are very short books. It's a series at Polity that's like very short. And so it's just a starter really, and a kind of call for more attention to this problem of pleasure, enjoyment and desire in the video game dream world. So one thing I'd like to see is that connection explored. And I think it could also be explored without psychoanalysis, although psychoanalysis is a great toolkit for studying those things. There are other ways in which you could explore the pleasures and enjoyments of video games. Secondly, I think we need to see video games less disconnected from other forms of new media and technology. And I think that's something I really tried to do in the book, as we've talked about in this conversation. We've talked about things like WeChat. We've talked about predictive applications, maybe like Google Maps. I also, in the book, talked about we've talked about Twitter, talked about Pokemon Go, and I've tried to talk about wider technological patterns. And I think in a way, these are even more pressing. I mean, we can see that our social life, our cities, our love lives, our friendships are being massively transformed by these kinds of technology, which are very closely connected to gaming, in my opinion. I mean, I can actually give concrete proof of that in terms of there are gaming companies like Beijing Kunlun Tech who bought Grindr, the gay hookup app, and there are gaming companies who also own social media platforms. So even on a corporate level, we're seeing that gaming is not separate from all these wider technological patterns. Like you yourself said, you're working on algorithms and things like that. I think that one thing I'd like to see with video game studies is increasing working across these distinctions between new technologies. I think that video gaming must be talked about alongside social media, alongside critical internet studies, alongside mobile phones especially. I mean, mobile phone gaming is now the dominant form. But so yeah, that's another way I'd like to see video game studies go, I think, in the direction of all these other technological things. And that will help us to explore the particular role of gaming in, it doesn't marginalize gaming at all. It's that approach will allow us to explore the particular and crucial role of gaming in these kinds of revolutions in desire and revolutions in the city and revolutions in social life that we're currently experiencing. So those are the two things which I'd say are most important. And the third one would be that I'd just like to see more engagement in the relationship between video games and politics. So again, these are three things. So problem of enjoyment and pleasure, connection between video games and other forms of emerging technology, which is transformative of social life. And thirdly, a close connection with political discourse, which, each of those I really have just touched upon in this tiny book. And I hope that the video game studies community and other forms of scholar will be interested in picking up those connections and doing different things with them.
Well, that makes me think of a question I was going to ask you earlier, which is, do you think that this is a conversation that needs to be had in terms of video game studies, or do you think it's something that could easily fit within a number of different disciplines? I'm especially curious because it seems like some departments and some schools are trying to create, let's say, if not a video game studies department, then at least a significant group that's what they're doing. And it seems like there's more books and more journals about video game studies, for example. But I'm also conflicted because I know that, people in English who are English scholars are studying video games, and people who are in sociology or criminology or many, many disciplines, they're studying these things too. Do you think it's almost becoming its own discipline and that's a good thing perhaps? Or do you think that this has to be an interdisciplinary approach? Yeah,
I mean, I was just going to say exactly that. I think that the only way to do this is through interdisciplinary approach. I mean, I'm actually in literature studies department. I suppose I'm somewhere between literature and philosophy generally, but then I've The last few years I've been working on technology almost exclusively, and I think there's a place for those video game studies departments, of course, but I think they definitely need to be interdisciplinary. I mean, even in this conversation, I think it was interesting to think about the right wing and the alt right and kind of this kind of meme culture and Chan boards and the gamer threads on Chan boards, gamer communities on Steam. It's really impossible to treat these things in isolation. So whether it comes from the game studies department or from various people from all across the university, I think we definitely have to take this kind of interdisciplinary approach. Of connecting up games with, especially communications and internet studies, criminology, and the literary elements are important. Although I'm a literary scholar, I don't really do literary study of games, but all those things are valid, and people in politics and the study of political discourse as well. So I think, we just have to, the interesting connections all arise from the interdisciplinary elements of video games. And that's really why I'm saying that video games are so important and worth studying, because they aren't a standalone thing. They are pervasive and invasive, and they touch upon almost every aspect of everyday life. They touch upon the realm of love, of politics, of friendships, of communication, in order to explore the immense kind of transformative power that video games have, we would just need that kind of interdisciplinary approach.
Like you said, this was a small book that you've written, but it has a lot of, potential at the very least to spark a lot of new conversations. What are you working on now?
Well, I'm going to write a book about technology and love. There are some great books touching on this. Mostly Dominic Petman's book "Love and Other Technologies." I think that's around 2006, and then the Shrechko Horvat has written a book called "The Radicality of Love." It's 2015. I think I'd like to specifically. I want to explore this kind of philosophy of love. So that would also be like Badiou and Roland Barthes. But I want to do so in relation to like technology, which concretely relates to love and desire. So sex robots, VR girlfriends, AI chatbots, e-condoms, smart condoms, very interesting, humorous elements, online dating. You're just seeing the most fascinating connections between love, technology, and politics at the moment. I mean, even take something like Trump.dating. The new website where you can find a match using an app which connects you with fellow Trump supporters.
I didn't know that existed.
That's a funny example of dating, love, and technology in one. Politics, love, and technology in one. And the e-condom is similar. It sort of syncs up with your smartphone, regulates and controls your sex life and monitors it and things like that.
I didn't know about that either.
And then I've got a kind of AI. Chatbots, girlfriends, and VR girlfriends, which incredibly kind of tend towards the kind of misogynistic and patriarchal as well. And so I want to explore this connection between politics, love, and technology, and do a whole book which deals with that, but in quite directly paying attention to concrete things which connect those things in our kind of technological world. So there'll be video game elements. I mean, there's a bizarre PlayStation VR product called Summer Lesson, which is a kind of, I'd say it's a VR girlfriend, but you just kind of sort of brush a young Japanese girl's hair and do sort of weird things. It's incredibly patriarchal products, but so there'll be a gaming element to it, but I'm going quite far away from gaming as well, and talking about this kind of theme of love and technology in a broader sense.
Oh, that sounds really great and really, really important. It scared me how much there are really two industries that are driving a lot of the technological innovation, and it's the sex industry and the military. I mean, those are the two. When you look into AI, which is what I'm teaching a special topics on artificial intelligence, those are the two things that are driving all of this. Is really the sex industry and the military. So maybe your next book needs to be on the military afterwards.
Yeah, yeah, that's very, very interesting. And quite. I mean, yes, this is concerning, maybe inevitable, but also something we need to be critically aware of. And yeah, I think that's great.
Anyway, I want to thank you very much for speaking to me today, especially about your book, The PlayStation Dreamworld. That is, like you said, it's a quick book and it's a really interesting. I'd say it's a great starter if somebody hasn't read a lot of video game studies or feels like that's not their niche. I think it's a really accessible book, but it's also really informative for somebody who has read about that stuff. And so, yeah, no, I really do appreciate your time today.
No, that's really great. I mean, I'm glad you liked it. And I think, yeah, I mean, this is really nice. I really like this kind of short form way of writing books. You know, it's not an academic study in the traditional sense. It's just a kind of provocative kind of short book, and it's dead fun to write. And it's been great fun to come on and talk to you about it. I think we covered some really interesting stuff, and it's, yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for inviting me on. Really appreciate it.